Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation in our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website, reminding our Internet viewers that questions can always be submitted during or at any time in the future by comment line at speaker@heritage.org through our email. For those in-house, if you'll make that courtesy check that cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin, it will also be appreciated. And of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference as well. Hosting our discussion today is Walter Lohman, Director of our Asian Studies Center. Prior to joining us here, he served as Senior Vice President and Executive Director of the US-ASEAN Business Council. Previous to that, he was the Council's Senior Country Director, representing interests in Indonesia and Singapore. He's also served as a Senior Professional Republican Staff Member for Ranking Member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, as well as a policy aide to Senator John McCain on trade, defense, and foreign policy issues. Please join me in welcoming Walter Lohman. Walter?
Thank you, guys. Well, thank you all for coming out. I really appreciate it. Taiwan's formal integration into the regional economy has always been a big priority of ours here at Heritage Foundation. We've done a number of programs on it, written quite a bit about it. Just in February, we did a program with the Taiwan Benevolent Association of America here, and focused largely, half on, anyway, on that. And we had a program in Taipei in December on some similar issues involving Japan and trilateral economic cooperation and security. We've been pursuing an FTA to no avail for only 30 years. I told the story last time we had this similar talk, because that's one of the first things I talked to Fulner about when I got here, was we needed an FTA with Taiwan. And he said, hey, that's a great idea. I tried 30 years ago. Didn't stop me, though. We're still pushing it. And we've been pushing for Taiwan's inclusion in TPP. But as the note advertising today's event mentioned, it's hard to know exactly where we stand on that in terms of the way that its benefits are perceived in Taiwan, whether there's really any prospect for it as far as the political leadership there is concerned, how the region would react, how would the other partners in that negotiation accommodate Taiwan's participation. It's not entirely clear that they would. It's not clear that our administration, the U.S., would either, without some sort of green light from Beijing. As much as I hate to say that, that's probably the case with the Obama administration. So that's kind of what I wanted to get at here today, is both the value of TPP to Taiwan and exactly what the holdup is on its getting involved in it. To help us try to figure it out, we've got four terrific panelists. The first, Man-Jung Chan. I told her earlier, actually, I have an easier time with Chinese than French, so the Mignon thing kind of threw me off. There's about 4 too many letters in there. But Mignon is the chair of the Global Strength Institute and an independent non-executive director at Standard Chartered Bank in Taiwan, among many other things, and I'd use up too much of our time, I think, to go through all of those. But she was also executive director of the Chinese Taipei APEC Study Center, 2011 and 2012, and she was former senior advisor to President Man-Jung, 2008 to 2010, at the National Security Council, where she advised him on a range of issues, including participation in international organizations, which is another topic we talk about quite a bit here with regard to Taiwan. I'll then turn to Jeff Schott. Jeff is senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Similarly here, there's a lot I could say. He's got a very long bio. He's been at Peterson since 1983. He's widely regarded as a leading authority on trade issues here in town. He's written quite a few books on those issues and on trade agreements specifically. I told him in inviting him over, I recounted how when I worked for McCain, and I won't say how many years ago, so it's to spare us both, but how dependent I was on his work there on NAFTA, and I believe also on Uruguay round at the time. You were very active, and he was on my speed dial, and in those days he was on my Rolodex, but that probably dates me as well. We'll then turn to Rupert Hammond-Chambers. Rupert is a familiar face to everyone here, I'm sure. Probably familiar to many people that are tired of being familiar with Rupert, but he's there anyway. You know, you can't get away from him. But seriously, Rupert is a friend and a frequent collaborator here at Heritage Foundation. We work together on quite a few things. A trusted voice on American business interests in Taiwan. He's been at the council since 1994. He's been president there since the year 2000. And then we'll finish up with Derek Scissors. Derek will correct everyone else on the panel, no doubt. That's sort of Derek's lot in life, is to correct other people's misperceptions and misunderstandings. But Derek has been at Heritage now at least 4 years, right? Almost 5.
Closing 5, yeah.
Yeah, closing on 5 years. Before that, he was in the for-profit private sector, writing on the Chinese economy and advising Fortune 500 clients. Since coming to Heritage, he's developed, I think, a good voice on Taiwan and understanding of the Taiwan economy as he closes in on a Chinese-like expertise on every economy in East Asia. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Min-Jung. She can get us started. What I hope to do is just take maybe 10 minutes each, and then we can open it up to question and answer. Thank you. Whichever you want. Okay, yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lohman. Thank you for having me. This is a very cozy podium. I like to be called Man-Jung, but usually Westerners pronounce me as Ma-Jung. So
It's a gamble.
yeah. But anyway, thank you. So for the 10 minutes that I have, I think I will very briefly introduce Taiwan's current situation in terms of our policy for a policy toward a golden decade, so to speak. Now, in parallel to that, TPP, Trans-Pacific Partnership, is very much coincide with our seeking for quality, competitiveness with the regional partners. And then later on, I'll point it to some of the challenges that we face if we are to integrate it into the regional economic integration schemes, including TPP. So first of all, the golden decade that we have in mind basically is to create a growth strategy that is in parallel to APEC growth strategy. That is to have secure growth, inclusive growth, sustainable growth, and then the innovative growth, as well as sustainable growth. Basically, just like regional economic integration, we have two axes. One is for growth, another is for peace. So peace and prosperity, that is sort of enlightened aspiration for us and the regional partner. And then to chart it out, a growth strategy in that one cannot just seeking one axis at the expense of another. So in the disciplines of political economy, we are seeking to integrate with the region in that two axes. Now, TPP is supposed to be high quality, 21st century, comprehensive. So President Ma initially, in 2012, set up the target that coincide with the decade, golden decade, by saying that we will achieve TPP in 10 years. However, in 10 years, that will be 2022, which is 2 years behind the APEC schedule of 2020. Supposedly, APEC in 2020 was supposed to achieve FTAAP, Free Trade Area for Asia Pacific. Whether it is going to be completed through TPP or RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, that is sort of ASEAN centrality scheme. As part of the APEC members, Taipei, of course, is very much inspired to get into the regional economic integration as early as possible. By that, we know fully well that we need to do unilateral liberalization on our own on certain areas so that to sustain competitiveness. And this is why we have the so-called golden decade that we are aspire to achieve. And President Ma recently pointed to the so-called 3 arrows aspired by the Abenomics. We are looking into sort of following our orchestrated monetary policy, as well as doing more infrastructure investments, as well as open up pilot projects for free economic zone. These are the 3 arrows that is supposedly to increase our competitiveness, also in preparation for regional integration. Now, what are some of the challenges that we face if we are to prepare ourselves to join TPP? Just like any other existing TPP members under negotiation, we also face great challenges. We are very similar in our agricultural sector as in Japan. Have a lot of traditional agricultural sector that is getting used to the government's land reform, subsidies, and a special agricultural-related R&D, such as in the States as well. Now, the trade remedy device that we have in place will have to face great challenges. Now, also in the area of ROO, rules of origin, just like in Vietnam, the textile industry itself, because of our largest, biggest trading partner right now is PRC. So with ECFA in progress, that is expected to finish all components by the end of this year, we have more closer trade relations with mainland China, just like many other TPP existing members. Therefore, if China is not part of the TPP or part of any eventual regional schemes, it will be difficult for us because of the 29% of our trade basically is linked with PR China. Right. Now we also have other challenges such as environmental, labor issue, the so-called Singapore issues under WTO, although we have already finished the government procurement agreement. So in that area, perhaps it's less of a pressure. Now, due to the very nature of secrecy in TPP negotiation, that is no full text or no full background notes will be released until after the completion of TPP 4 years later on, as far as I understand. So we are really, sort of exploring TPP on the sideline, trying to preparing ourselves. And unlike Vietnam, which has the benefit of being an associate member first and then getting ready to prepare themselves, Taipei does not have that benefit so far. Now, with other trading partners, like-minded trading partners, we do hope that we will forge mutual benefit, win-win situation, not a zero-sum game. We, of course, like many others, we do not like to be put in a position of choosing one partner as to another. However, it is dedicated relations between China, Taiwan, and the United States. It's the dedicated relations that will contribute to the regional peace and prosperity. Therefore, Taiwan is operating in these 2 axes, and hopefully we will be very much part of these 2020 APEC's FTA AP very soon. Let me just stop right here, and then we'll see later on.
I've got a couple questions for you, but I'll hold till the end. Why don't you take over, Jeff?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to participate in this panel. Wonderful panelists. But no thanks for asking me to follow Man-Jung after a wonderful presentation, which I fully agree with. And but I'll try to build on some of the themes that she just mentioned, and hopefully that can add to our discussions going forward. The first thing, which is evident from Man-Jung's comments, is that Taiwan lives in a dynamic and very competitive neighborhood. And so you just can't stand aside and watch the world go by. You have to constantly improve. And so the focus on a growth strategy and on the need for unilateral reform, I think, is part of the dynamics of being in that neighborhood. You have to be able to continue to improve, to innovate, to keep up with the neighbors. Now, the problem there is that Taiwan's neighbors are engaged in a variety of regional economic integration projects, all of which exclude Taiwan except for APEC and for the various cross-straits trade pacts, which have been concluded or are in process, including the bilateral services agreement that was just signed this month. That's a, I think, very, very important one that deserves more attention going forward. Third point, Taiwanese exporters face increased competition in all of their major export markets, including the United States and the European Union, due to bilateral and regional deals that have recently been concluded, including the Korea-US Free Trade Agreement and the EU-Korea Free Trade Agreement, as well as those under construction, like the TPP, the EU-Japan negotiations, which have just recently started, which will have an impact, and the China-Korea FTA talks, which have been going on for more than a year. And that competition will come because of the special preferences that are accorded under these preferential trading agreements to their direct competitors in Japan, in Korea, in the United States. I'd say the preferences are less profound in the intra-Asian deals to date, but those are also being broadened and deepened as a result of new negotiations on a regional comprehensive economic partnership, the RCEP, which has only just started and will take some time to reach any fruitful conclusion. So there's a natural desire to get into the game and avoid new discrimination. And I think that's perfectly understandable. And as well, there is the political potholes that have been on the road to that goal for a long time. Now, is TPP the answer for Taiwan? And I would say most likely not. And I say that not looking at the 10-year time frame of President Ma, but looking at a more near to medium-term outlook. Because regardless of the political pressures, Taiwan isn't ready to join the talks now. And the talks are moving forward. Probably the only country that would be able to join the TPP 12 countries, including Japan, which will be joining next month, and participate before the TPP deal is cut, is Korea. And it's unclear whether Korea will join, but I would say if you're looking at who is going to be at the table when the TPP is first signed, it will be a maximum, the 12 countries, possibly 13. But it's still unclear that all of the 12 countries will be able to commit to the extensive obligations once the deal is completed. Vietnam is going to have to make some difficult decisions, and that part of the bargaining process is still not fully developed. Other countries will have to wait until the TPP is in force and open to new members, and those new members will have to renegotiate the terms of entry to the TPP, even though there will be an accession clause. Accession clauses always require a renegotiation. We can talk a little bit more about how you get into the TPP process. You have to ask to get in, and you have to be accepted by all the current members, and I think that's part of the reason why there's a reluctance on both sides to move forward at this stage. But I think there are a lot of positive opportunities that Taiwan is already engaged in that could yield substantial benefits. And in my view, certainly in the near to medium term, Taiwan should focus on contributing to APEC progress towards a free trade area of the Asia-Pacific, which by definition would include them in a deal with the other major Asia-Pacific economies, and which will not follow the TPP template in any event. Very difficult to see how the TPP will be the model, and it will probably be too comprehensive, too rigorous for all of the APEC membership to agree to. But it could provide a number of precedents, and along with the lessons learned from the RCEP negotiations, could provide ideas for building a hybrid agreement that would link the Asia-Pacific and intra-Asian economic integration initiatives into a scheme that could accommodate all the members of APEC, including Taiwan. And that would yield substantial benefits for Taiwan, because it would allow Taiwan to come in and basically redress the discrimination that has come about in the variety or large number of the preferential trading agreements that have arisen in the region over the last decade or more. Now that hybrid pact, which is still under discussion on what is the appropriate pathway for an FTAAP, is under discussion in APEC, where Taiwan has a clear voice and has been playing a very constructive role. And so I think we will see more interest in moving forward in that direction and linking together aspects of the hard law obligations of the TPP with the soft law approach of intra-Asian regionalism and the new provisions developed in the RCEP. It doesn't mean that the TPP would be watered down, because I know there's a lot of concern here in Washington that we not water down the high-quality agreement that's under construction. For the countries that are signatories to the TPP, they would maintain among themselves the high standards. But there could possibly be a umbrella agreement over the various integration arrangements in the region, and that could conceivably be how APEC finally comes to terms with the free trade area of the Asia-Pacific. One final point, Taiwan also needs to work with the United States, Japan, the EU, and China to get a WTO deal moving forward. Taiwan has been an active participant in the WTO negotiations. This is where you can get the biggest bang for the buck in multilateral deals, but the multilateral process has basically stalled out and indeed is in risk of falling apart completely. The Bali Ministerial in December of this year, the WTO meeting of trade ministers, is critical in determining whether there will be continued support for using the multilateral forum for trade negotiations. And a deal, even a down payment on a broader WTO deal, needs to be crafted together at Bali in order for the WTO process to regain the trust and confidence of many trade ministers around the world, including right here in Washington. I think Taiwan can play a part in working with the major trading nations, both developed and developing, in forging that consensus to get a trade facilitation deal and perhaps a little more. so that work on a broader multilateral package of agreements could move forward. I think that would supplement or complement the efforts in the region and serve Taiwanese economic interests very well. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Jeff. Rupert?
Thank you, Walter, for putting on today's program and giving us an opportunity to talk about this important issue, and to all of you for coming out to hear us talk. Some of us for, Lord knows how many times you've heard us talk, but we promise to say new things today. We promise. TIFA, TPP, Taiwan, the US, China. These are some of the words that swirl around the possibility of Taiwan's inclusion in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Just quickly, so we can move on to Derek and then get into question and answers. I just want to touch on where we are in the TIFA negotiation, because I want to start with TIFA, because for me, it's TIFA, then it's TPP. If we want to talk about US support for Taiwan's candidacy as a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we have to understand where US-Taiwan economic relations are. So, quick briefing on the status of negotiations, and then have a quick look at Taiwan's domestic political scene. How genuine is President Ma's desire to see Taiwan as a member of TPP now, in the short to medium term? What sort of prospects are there for US leadership? Is the Obama administration willing or even able to offer leadership on significant initiatives with Taiwan? And then prospects. So, as I said, the prospects and some of the dynamics, perhaps, is China's interest in TPP sincere, and how potentially does that play out? The TIFA was relaunched on March the 10th. By all accounts, it was a very successful meeting. Taiwan showed great flexibility. It was moved forward a day to accommodate not quite then acting Ambassador Morantis. We almost had a cabinet officer in Taiwan, almost. But for some reason, we don't seem to quite be able to get that done. But Mr. Morantis is an extremely experienced and able representative for our country on trade matters. And by all accounts, the dialogue was productive. Now where we find ourselves is in the minutia of the broad brushstrokes that were discussed in that day-long meeting. We have representatives, my good friend Henry on my right, down in the audience, who works for the Economic Ministry. Rick, who's sitting in front of me, are two of the people who, with lots of trade negotiation experience, are very much in the weeds, engaged on how to move forward some of the understandings that were made on March the 10th. And those discussions have swirled around technical barriers to trade, the acronym being TBT, which the US generally discusses with Taiwan under the auspices of the WTO. But we now have a new TIFA working group set up to discuss TBT matters. And other working groups that both sides have decided to focus in on that would allow for framing a more ambitious agenda, not, regrettably, a free trade agreement, and that would require actually Mr. Obama and this administration to have a bilateral free trade agreement policy. There seems to be much more multilaterally orientated, which is fine, I suppose. And the focus on the potential for a bilateral investment agreement in the next several years, a tax agreement, and possibly a number of other agreements in certain areas. And of course, we have the ongoing thorny, and the Taiwan press just loves to write about issues such as pharmaceuticals and agriculture. That would be rice for any journalists, and pork. Oh, he said the P word. It used to be the B word, didn't it? Now it's the P word. But in any event, I don't mean to be flippant. The ag issues are very serious, regrettably, and are going to represent a significant hurdle for any Taiwan president, Mr. Ma or his successor or successors, in getting Taiwan to a point where trading partners in the region can look at Taiwan legitimately and say, yes, Taiwan is ready and serious about becoming a member or negotiating and engaging us in negotiating on becoming a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, or for that matter, any other regional partnership that may pop up. So the negotiations are ongoing between AIT, USTR, And very encouragingly, both of those institutions have been working very closely with a number of departments around the US government to try and get them vested and interested in this trade dialogue, to see if we can fold in important areas of not just discontent between the two parties, but also opportunities for growth and for cooperation. So I suppose the next question is, well, what do we have? What do we see over the next 6 to 9 months as we move to what we hope would be a follow-up TIFA meeting here in the U.S. sometime in the late winter of 2014? Mostly, it will be negotiations between the Economic Ministry and the USTR-AIT team, mostly over telephones and satellites, given the restrictive nature of budgets and travel budgets, I should say. And we hope that over this next period there will be progress. I say that because that's not in the bag, and my sense is from interacting with certainly trade negotiators on our side is that they're excited about the fact that things are relaunched. They are cautiously optimistic about what can be achieved. But there's also a recognition that there's been a lot of pain in the relationship, the economic relationship, over a number of years. And there's a very strong need and requirement to see progress in respect to the minuta negotiations moving forward to the next TIFA, so that a case can be made for high-level representation and the TIFA taking place, and what we would hope then would be further discussion of steps towards significant agreements like the BIA or the tax agreement. So that's where we stand on the actual negotiations. Ongoing, steady progress. Both sides are engaged. There's a significant schedule in place, and by all accounts, both parties are working hard to execute what the political leadership has outlined as reasonable goals in the next 1 to 2 years. Well, let's flash to Taiwan for a second. Mr. Ma, I'm going to disagree with you 1 second. Actually, Mr. Ma talks about 8 years as opposed to 10 for his timeline. If he waits 8 years, or if Taiwan waits 8 years to become a member of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where will Taiwan be in respect to its competitors in the region? Will it be even if it's ready, where will it be in conjunction to the Koreans? How much further along the lines will China be in respect to competing with Taiwan head-to-head, and all other Taiwan's regional competitors and those that might spring out of Southeast Asia? 8 years is too long, and if we look at Mr. Ma's domestic political situation, it's very difficult to make a case that he's going to be in a position to push through the sort of reforms required to persuade the U.S. principally, and then other trading partners like Japan, who may be persuadable to support their candidacy, that Taiwan should be accepted in a shorter time frame, which is essential, in my view, to ensure that Taiwan does not continue to fall ever further into China's economic sphere. Taiwan's domestic situation, Mr. Ma gets re-elected in 2012, and he immediately jumps into the economic reform fray with energy prices, pension reform. In my view, he had basically the policies right. He went in, he got absolutely hammered by the opposition. Well, that's understandable, but he also got very little support from his own party, and that was most unfortunate. Ma's, for those of you who have read President Ma's speech when he was inaugurated in May, it's an excellent speech, and a big chunk of it's focused on economic reform. And really, the language is absolutely spot on. It is a template and roadmap for TPP accession, but it requires political leadership. And he attempted to give it, and really he got wrapped very hard over the knuckles by the political class, regrettably. And from that time onwards, we've had economic drift on the part of Taiwan's. Yes, some economic policies that Man-Jung mentioned, but frankly, those are sort of that really is playing at the edges. It's not the sort of significant change that Taiwan's economy needs at this juncture to accelerate the process of integration regionally and the political process for Taiwan's inclusion in that. And this economic situation, poor economic process, it undermines President Ma's ability to make change, to present change to the Kuomintang caucus and to argue for legislative action or even executive action if legislative action isn't required, to really get reform, a second process of reform, the first being WTO accession and the changes that had to come there, a second process of reform that will accelerate Taiwan's candidacy and also Taiwan's ongoing reform process that would, in the long term, in my view, benefit Taiwan. So you have that. You have the KMT looking at the five elections at the end of next year. Not much support within the party for Ma rocking the boat on thorny economic reform issues. And then once those 5 elections are over with, we're right into the Taiwan presidential election. And the DPP is very much heading in the right direction. Susan Jung had a very strong visit to Washington, D.C. recently. And I would expect, certainly, the DPP to have a fairly significant, perhaps this is foolhardy of me, but nevertheless, a fairly well thought out and well presented China policy, which I believe will be essential to persuading the Taiwan people that the DPP is ready to rule again. My point simply is that the Taiwan presidential election in 2016 is going to be tight. It is going to be right down to the wire, but I expect both parties to have extremely strong candidates and extremely strong platforms, and neither party is going to be interested in making decisions or undertaking actions that may potentially undermine that. If you look at that through the prism of domestic economic reform, I would suggest to all of you it's highly unlikely that the Ma government is going to undertake any kind of economic reform that would move it closer to consideration for TPP in his second term. So, So anyway, I just want to quickly wrap up. When I spoke at the beginning of the year, Walter very kindly included me in the session that we had earlier this year. Nadia, is Nadia here? Yeah. So you asked me a question about, what sort of indicators will we have for how serious the Ma government is? There were quite a lot of statements coming out of the Ma government about how serious they were about Taiwan-US economic relations and the importance of getting that going. And how would we tell? And I would, my answer to you is, well, look for delegations, look for cabinet officers to come, look for an overt public expression of how serious the Ma government is about accelerating the economic dialogue with the US and putting itself in a position not just to really take advantage of TIFA, but also to look at TPP from a more urgent perspective. And you're a very good journalist, Nadia, and there are other journalists in here. How many cabinet officers have we had visit since then? None. How many sub-cabinet officers? Well, Vice Minister Joe came from the Ministry of Economic Affairs. Didn't come to D.C., but he did come, and I think he went to Chicago. And Henry, where did he go to? Chicago and San Francisco? You don't know? But anyway, it was the West Coast.
Else you want to put on the spot?
I know. Hey, listen, I'm on fire today. And West Coast and the Midwest. But really, we haven't seen it. We're 6 months in. And again, you're getting this from somebody who wants, in the worst way, to see US-Taiwan economic relations reach what it can reach, attain the goals it can attain. And I think it's all out there for the US and Taiwan in that respect. But regrettably, there's a lot of distraction, a lot of over-focus on China to the detriment of US-Taiwan relations. And I think that is true, too, for a more ambitious policy that could accelerate Taiwan's consideration for TPP membership. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Rupert. I'm not sure, but you probably missed Nadia's filing deadline.
Did I? What's today, Wednesday?
It was 6 months ago.
So Friday. I'll look for your piece on Friday. Yeah.
Derek?
Okay, I mean, we want to get to questions and answers. I'll try to hold this to 5 minutes. First thing is, I think Man-Jung was actually being nice to her American hosts, because what she could have said is, it's very difficult to talk about TPP in Taiwan because the administration is on a systematic disinformation campaign about TPP. There's not an intentional disinformation campaign, but if you look back over administration statements, a lot of them turn out to be untrue, certainly about the schedule, and now they're in private at least, they backtrack about a lot of claims made about specifics. So we're guessing about TPP. Not just because it's not done, but because we're not getting full information from the administration. There are fights within the administration, I know, because I'm part of them. And, then what Congress is going to do and with TPA and so on. I'm going to assume for the sake of the next 5 minutes that we have a real TPP. I don't want anyone to get confused that I think we'll actually get a real TPP. I think it's substantially possible we'll get an agreement that isn't comprehensive, that isn't a high standard, that isn't any of the things that it's been talked about for years. I don't think that's likely because there's so much talk that somebody needs to back it up, but there's just a lot of disturbing elements that if this were a TPP panel, we could go into detail on. Now, assuming TPP is real, start with the U.S. side. U.S. economic interests, it's very nice, and Taiwan punches way above its weight as a trade partner for the U.S. It's very nice for the U.S. to have Taiwan in the supply chain, especially in consumer electronics, some other things. But they can be squeezed out of the supply chain. Let's take TPP member Japan at the top and TPP member Malaysia at the bottom, because Malaysia is a host for consumer electronics production, and give them preferential treatment of the TPP where they have tighter integration with the U.S. market, Taiwan's going to get pushed out. And even more so if the Koreans, as was mentioned earlier, decide that they want to join after they sign an agreement with the Chinese, because it's pretty easy for them to join TPP. So it's nice for the U.S. to have Taiwan as a big trading partner. I'm not sure TPP doesn't mean that Taiwan becomes much less important as U.S. trading partner. Not a little bit less, a lot less. That's pursuant to something I said from the first moment I got here, is that Taiwan needs to be far more aggressive than the island thinks. I think a lot of people think that. I'll try to be a little bit blunt about it. 23 million people, no resources. Strong workforce, good entrepreneurs, plenty of capital, but it's really easy to substitute for 23 million people and no resources. It's not, people look, economics is not about looking at somebody's qualities in isolation, it's about looking at the available substitutes. And Taiwan could be substituted for really easily. That's the fate of small countries. So there's a major danger here, and that I don't think is fully recognized in Taiwan. I was co-author of the paper in a project that Rupert was part of, published by AEI last fall, saying, Taiwan can't, that situation is difficult. That situation Taiwan's in is difficult, and we all know the political reasons for it, but the best response, because you don't know whether TPP is going to be good or bad, or RCEP's going to be good or bad, and what's going to happen with APEC. And I completely agree with Jeff that Taiwan should be pushing APEC and WTO in every button it has. Should be working as hard as it can in every avenue. So I totally agree with that, but you don't know how those are going to turn out. And in particular, I can imagine a story where the APEC, 8 years, that APEC process could take 15 years. So the thing that Taiwan can control is its own liberalization. And I say that even though Rupert just, poured cold water over any such idea very effectively. But that is, in fact, still the thing that when we talk about TPP, whether TPP turns out to be real or not real, whether TPP is open to Taiwan in the short term or only open in the long term, whatever happens with APEC, what Taiwan controls is its own policy. And it can become an excuse that no one will let us in and we have to wait and there's this reason not to do anything and that reason not to do anything. And what I try to say about the U.S. econ interest side, and I'll say it about Taiwan as well, Taiwan's interests, is that if you wait too long, you lose. And I think Taiwan is headed towards being cut out of regional trade, even more than it is now, because regional trade now has been mostly diplomatic. It's a bunch of agreements that Taiwan doesn't get to sign. Now we have the possibility of more real agreements, and Taiwan is behind the curve on preparing for those in its own internal preparations. TPP carrot, rather, is if we get a good TPP and Taiwan's part of it, I think Taiwan's improvements in IPR, its strength in areas where IPR really matters in technology. I think TPP's advancement of the IPR agenda, U.S. IPR agenda, and some other countries is going to benefit Taiwan. I think services liberalization will benefit Taiwan in terms of domestic efficiency and give Taiwan better access to foreign markets. I think agricultural, opening up agriculture will improve land use patterns, which is very important when you don't have a lot of land. So I think there are a lot of benefits to TPP if Taiwan could work that way, and I'll just close by being negative again. Rules of origin are a big issue that is not resolved in the agreement, and they could go a lot of different directions. I won't mention who, but there are administration officials who've directly contradicted things they've said 2 years ago about rules of origin. But if the rules of origin are difficult, the rules of origin could be drafted such they make it very much more difficult for TPP partners to want to include Taiwan. Because of the connection to China, for some other reasons, there are a variety of possibilities. But I actually see TPP, we can talk about TPP opportunities, there are opportunities. We can talk about all the things Taiwan should be doing, which TPP may not be first among them, but I am more and more seeing a good TPP as a threat because Taiwan isn't ready to join, and the way I see a good TPP being configured, it's possible that it will do significant harm to Taiwan's competitiveness with the existing TPP countries.
Thank you. We're going to open it up to questions. While you think about that question, I'm going to table one. It seemed like, except for Derek's last comment there, it sounded like we got, closer and closer to TPP. I mean, we started out at 10 years, and then Jeff talked about not in the immediate term, which I assume means perhaps later down the road, and I think you alluded to that. And then Rupert focused on getting the TIFA done, but still saw some urgency. And then Derek seemed to think that it ought to join as soon as possible, except at the end, which I assume you're talking about political willingness to join.
The end was, if
immediately.
you don't join, it's a threat.
Yeah, but I'm mystified by the time schedules. Like, for instance, is Man-Jung's real metric here some sort of golden decade, some sort of conceptual, almost rhetorical device? Is that really his metric for determining when they will be ready? And if it's something more economic along the lines that Jeff alluded to, why is Vietnam or Peru or Malaysia ready? In a way, are they more developed countries than Taiwan? I mean, what makes them ready for this, especially Vietnam, but not Taiwan? So, Man-Jung, if you could address that, and Jeff, and if others want to chime in, I welcome it.
I don't know how ready is Vietnam and Peru. However,
But they will be in the
we-
final agreement.
we actually, when you are part of the negotiation, you learn the rope, you know the details, you know how to get yourself ready in terms of structural reform, in terms of your sectorial challenges that you face up to. Now, I like to put two extra points, if I may, at this point, that was raised earlier. One is the China factor. Now, United States and China, the bilateral relations, that you have China as your number one source of import, number two, export destination, number three, investment partner. Now, you are asking us the question why we put so much weight on China. China currently with TPP partners, they have 6 among the 12. They have bilateral FTAs. All right, you have close partners within the TPP that have told the United States, if TPP is going to be anti-China, we're going to walk out. So let's not just questioning or weigh in whether Taiwan is more waiting on China or on the U.S. Back in 2005, for the first time ever, Taiwan's trading partner shifted from the U.S. as number one trading partner to China, PR China is number one. So let's just put this to rest in terms of weighing who is, emphasizing more on a trading partner. Our circumstances as such that in 2010, when ASEAN and China's FTA is in effect, that we were worried about our sort of exit of our company into ASEAN countries. Ying-jeou automobile companies can set up a factory in Malaysia and immediately get discount of auto parts export to mainland China from 0 to 7%. Whereas if Ying-jeou stay in Taiwan without an ECFA, then the export tariff will be 17 to 25%. So that is out of the necessity. We need to set up ECFA. By that token, I want to put back to another question raised. Many of our ASEAN partners have told us, you emphasize too much about being marginalized. No, Taiwan, you are very much part and parcel of the supply chain connectivity in the region. So we have a talk here talking about that 23 million people could be written off, can be replaced easily. We do not look at it that way as yet. We still maintain a key role in supply chain connectivity, although our sense of alarm, perhaps in other trading partners' eyes, are overly exaggerated. We don't mean to exaggerate that. Now, President Ma's capability or will to get into this regional scheme, that there should be no question about it, even though there has been setback, firstly because of the U.S. beef issue. The domestic blue camp KMT parties' discontent starts out from there, to set up U.S. beef as a precondition for TIFA. Not to mention that over the past decades, we have the issue about IPR issue, that we solve it. Another precondition issue will be pharmaceutical issue. We try to solve it. Now it's beef issue. Now US-Chamber of Commerce is going to tell us pork issue without naming it too loud. Say pork, right? But remains to be an issue that this drives the domestic discontent in many other areas, and to be followed up with a lot of reforms. Reform has never been easy. Change has never been easy, particularly in the setting of bipartisan political sort of dynamics. So with that said, that I think that there should be no question about the will, and then capability we'll see in due course. Thank you.
Jeff, could you comment on the timing?
There's always confusion, questions of timing of a trade agreement, because politicians always want instant or immediate gratification. And so when they sign a deal, they want to see the benefits flowing to their constituents from day one. But trade agreements don't work that way. They codify what is going on day one, but some of the more sensitive restrictions and discrimination and regulatory barriers take a while to be phased out, so that there's an adjustment period to allow firms and workers to accommodate more competition in the domestic marketplace. So that means that on day one, there isn't going to be immediate discrimination or a change in practice. And a lot of the trade agreements that have already been entered into that discriminate against Taiwan, a lot of those barriers or those preferences haven't been phased in yet. Now, there are some that do. The bigger problem for Taiwan is the one Man-Jung was referring to, in that businesses plan ahead. And when they see a policy regime changing direction, they will begin to alter their investment strategies to take account of that changing policy environment. And so you will have investment diversion, maybe even before the deal is closed. And that's something that is already taking place in the region. It's interesting that you asked the question the way you did, Walter. I was in Indonesia earlier this year and talking about TPP, and the Indonesian officials came to me and they said, how can Vietnam be ready? We're having problems. We're so much better than Vietnam. How can Vietnam be ready? And the answer that I gave them is, I don't think Vietnam has as many choices as you do. They're in a very difficult situation. They're much less developed. They're facing much more competitive pressures. And the political regime has at least seemingly committed to a long-term strategy of economic reform that probably will be accommodated in the TPP agreement. But that's looking out over a 10-year horizon or maybe even longer in terms of introducing the reforms, particularly in Vietnam, because of their extensive government intervention in the marketplace. That will have to be revised, and that will have impact on politics. In that sense, Taiwan is a little like Indonesia. It has more options. It is better off, but it is facing still a challenge over the medium and long term, a competitiveness challenge, which it will lose. And so do you plan ahead? Do you develop a 10-year golden decade growth strategy? And do you do a combination, as Man-Jung was detailing, of domestic reform and international initiatives to help you achieve that goal? And I think that's the challenge going forward for Taiwan, being able to muster the domestic political support to pursue both the national and the international initiatives.
Great, thanks.
I'm going to interpret the question a little bit differently and look at it through, again, through Taiwan's domestic political prism. I think that, as I noted, President Ma's speech when he was inaugurated is an absolute must-read if you're interested in Taiwan economic policy, because he absolutely gets it. And I really do believe that. I absolutely believe that President Ma understands what's necessary, but he's not Prime Minister in a British political system, right, where you can go to Parliament and you can push this stuff through. Taiwan's political system is much more complex than that. President Ma demonstrated a willingness to start tackling some of this stuff, and he got hammered hard. And it's further complicated by the fact that he's not popular, mostly, I would argue, as a consequence of poor economic performance that comes from Taiwan's over-reliance on trade. So you've got this situation that Taiwan's stuck in, and I thought that the point that you made about the competitiveness challenge that they will lose, that's a very profound point to make. And the stakes are high here. This isn't just some sort of intellectual discussion about whether Taiwan gets into TPP this year, next year, or in 10 years. If Taiwan is marginalized and becomes unstable as a consequence, I'm not talking about people rioting in the streets, but I'm talking about raising the level of angst about what Man-Jung noted was an essential policy, the ECFA. It was the right thing to do. It absolutely was. And sorting out Taiwan's economic relationship with China, very important. But it's only the right policy if it comes hand in hand with integration, regional and global integration, with what's going on in the direction of trade liberalization at the moment. And that's a big question. Because if it does not come with that other piece, then what's happening with China policy is going to, over the longer term, be inherently destabilizing. Because I would argue that the Chinese will increasingly show less appetite for giving concessions to Taiwan and increasingly pressure them. And my view is that the people, my interpretation, my analysis of how Taiwan feels about its democracy, separate of economic integration and economic well-being, is very different when you talk about democracy, political integration with the Chinese, and so on. And that's where the rubber meets the road, and that's, to me, where we start talking about U.S. national interest and what our policy makers should be doing when they think about this issue and the trajectory and arc of it, and how serious a problem it could potentially be for us further down the road.
Do you want to say anything?
I mostly agree with Jeff. Taiwan's in a situation where things are not so bad now, and there are a lot of strengths. And there's also a lot of uncertainty, so you can imagine stories where Taiwan doesn't really need to act very dramatically. Maybe the TPP doesn't quite work the way it's supposed to, or maybe they're really long phase-in periods and no one else can join, or the rules of origin aren't the way I think they're going to be. But I think the point I wanted to make, and he actually probably made it better with the analogy to Indonesia, is I'm not sure that there's an awareness in Taiwan about timing, so this sort of gets to your question, Walter. When you realize, if it becomes the case, it is not guaranteed by any means, but if it becomes the case that there's a recognition in Taiwan that, wow, the way the regional and global architecture is developed with a very strong TPP, and the U.S. running to go off to negotiate with Europe and not interested in WTO movement, for example, and not engaging its other partners very heavily, that Taiwan's in significant danger. You can't snap your fingers and fix that. You can't wake up in 2016 and say, oh, wow, we're going to change our minds and then we'll solve this problem in 2 years. The problem takes a long time to develop, and so does the solution. And that's why the warnings have to come early, even though it's possible that someone like me is exaggerating and the danger isn't that heavy. If I tell you 3 years from now that, wow, I should have told you a while ago, that puts Taiwan in a bad position. So the timing issue there is the solutions don't have to, the problems aren't that far away, but that doesn't mean the solutions don't have to be adopted as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you. Let me, Anthony, why don't you?
Thank you. Great presentation. I'm Anthony Kim. I'm with our Center for International Trade and Economics here at the Heritage Foundation. I want to revisit Walter's opening remark. In fact, if you go back to year 2002 and 2003, I'm talking about this because that's the beginning of the US-Korea FTA. Nobody back then expected it. People laughed at it. People just discarded, any possibility of sudden launch of US-Korea FTA. But it happened, rather suddenly and abruptly. And now we have it, right? And now, fast forward, we are in 2013. 3 things quickly. One, Senator Max Baucus, he'll be exiting next year. He will not seek his re-election. So we will have a new dynamic in Senate Finance Committee. And 2, we have Mike Froman as a new USTR. He supposedly has a better understanding in terms of security angle and everything. So it's a new momentum. And 3, we may have TPA, Trade Promotion Authority, this year. So do you see any possible new momentum for US-Taiwan FTA coming? I mean, I'm not talking about this year or early next year, but probably before 2016. And if we can start the US-Taiwan FTA talk, maybe we can move forward.
I'm just going to be unrelentingly negative. The U.S. has way too much on its plate right now as it is. TPP is hard. It's not finished. We have some vague, but I shouldn't say vague. It's pretty vague. There's some level of commitment to TTIP. Those are landing 2,000-pound fish. And then there's Taiwan and many other countries off to the side. I guess you're right that you can find some positive steps. I know you are, and
Other people have tried with Derek and
yeah,
failed,
it doesn't
so-
work, right? The weather's terrible. Whatever it is
It's
outside,
tough. It's
it's
tough.
bad. You're right. There are some reasons to be positive, but the U.S. has a really full plate right now. If TTIP is serious, I just don't see what else is going to get squeezed in there.
I must admit, I love where your heart's at too. I really do. And for those of us who've been arguing on how essential an FTA is, wouldn't that be fantastic? But I would cite back to my comments about TPP and the TIFA and where our working level teams are in respect to our economic relationship with Taiwan and a willingness to advocate for something significant and ambitious in the next several years. Like TPP membership, FTA is exactly the same. Even if Mr. Obama stood forward and said, we're ready to do bilaterals, I'm going to double the size of USTR, I find it inconceivable that Taiwan would be on that list, sadly. It should be, but it won't be.
So what's the good news, Jeff?
Well, the good news is that you were talking about the book that I wrote on Korea, U.S. 12 years ago. That was ignored for a couple of years. But it was ignored for an important reason, because neither side was willing to talk to each other while basic trade differences continued to create friction in the relationship, particularly on agriculture. And once the Koreans took steps to restructure their agricultural programs, it opened up a dialogue that eventually led to the launch of negotiations. Now, I think through a variety of studies that have been made over the last decade, Rupert has been involved in quite a few of these and helped sponsor some, there's a good understanding of the trade issues that create friction in the U.S.-Taiwan bilateral relationship. But I think in terms of moving forward in the short term and the medium term, again, the least obstructed avenue is to use APEC. Because that's where we're talking, and to try to link via the APEC umbrella back to TPP after the deal is cut, because nothing is going to happen because of agenda overload and a variety of other reasons over the next year or two. So that would be my quick response.
Mike?
Thanks for a great panel. I'm Mike Fonte. I'm the director of the DPP's mission here in Washington, D.C. I'd like you to unpack for me a little bit, Rupert, and maybe Derek as well. Dr. Chan has talked, you've talked about President Ma giving a great speech about the need for reform and then not being able to deliver, and of course he was, quotes, hammered by the opposition. It seems to me part of the problem, and this is what I'd like to hear you look at, is how do you unpack the KMT's long-term relationship to a wide variety of economic institutions and the impact that's having. Taipower, for example. Instead of raising prices on Joe Blow or Dr. Chen down the street, what's happening at the larger level of the structure and organization of Taipower that would allow it to keep its rates low? Those kinds of questions, it seems to me, are what's going to impact the future of Taiwan as in terms of liberalization. So maybe you could look at a couple of specific things like that, because I think when Chairman Su was here, he heard from a wide variety of sectors that your economy is unbalanced, needs to be rebalanced. And I think he's willing to try that, but the question is how, and so I'd like to hear from you.
Sure, Mike. Thank you. There's the Ma government, since it took over in 2008, has had a policy of privatization of state assets. A policy, in fact, the Wall Street Journal's European edition today has an excellent piece about how Mrs. Thatcher used privatization as an important mechanism for reform in the early to mid 80s of Britain's economy, and the significant economic deliverables that came as a consequence. It totally resonated with me, not just because I lived through it, but because it's entirely applicable for Taiwan too, and for some of the things that we've been discussing on the panel. The requirement to accelerate the process of reform. Selling state assets is absolutely part and parcel of that. You mentioned Taipower, Chinese Petroleum. Surely there are almost 30 companies, I think, under the Economic Ministry alone. And all of them have, at the top, political appointees who are run. I mean, many of these executives are come out of the permanent bureaucracy, but nevertheless, they're selected and appointed by the president's office and the cabinet, or I suppose the premier, under the direction of the president's office. So, yes, state-owned enterprises, some have an important positive, or very few have an important positive impact on the purse. Most are a burden. But all of them have the potential to be directed in a way that might impact the political arena. Energy prices, you certainly cited, have been a hot political potato, particularly when Mr. Ma launched, again in my view, quite rightly, into trying to reform the process of energy pricing at the beginning of his second term last year. The only way to deal with this issue is to get the government out of the business of running businesses. Absolutely the only way to do it, and depoliticize the energy space, depoliticize banking. That's another very, very good example as well, where you've got the tremendous overinvestment, I regret to point out, Mike, during the Chen Shui-bian era, in the DRAM space, and what's transpired now with non-performing loans in state-owned banks, and of course the distress that these companies are now under due to heavy debt loads, heavy debt loads. So again, I think during the Chen era, during the Ma era, we've got instances where state-owned enterprises have been utilized to direct investment flows for ostensibly economic reasons, political gains, to curry favor with important constituencies. It's damaging and could and should be an important part of Taiwan's domestic reform process. When I was last in Taiwan, I sat with a very senior person at the finance ministry and asked him how the privatization process was going for the banks. And he looked at me, he goes, "Rupert, what privatization process?" So the policy is still ostensibly to privatize state-owned enterprises, but as a practical matter, the government is not following that policy at the moment.
I'll have a very specific and a very general comment. The very specific comment is you want to talk about state-owned enterprises. TPP is potentially extremely valuable. Potentially. There is a fight going on now over what competitive neutrality is going to mean for the TPP as opposed to what the OECD and Australians think it means. But it's potentially very valuable. It's something that would allow Taiwan, there'd be political cover in Taiwan to take actions that should be taken to reform state-owned enterprises. It wouldn't be done on a partisan basis, so whoever's in charge is immediately attacked by the other side if they try to reform. So, you know, on a hopeful sign, because Walter always wants me to be hopeful, on a hopeful sign, you know, if there's a good SOE chapter in TPP, which is definitely possible, the battle is being waged, that could be very helpful to Taiwan. And it doesn't require Taiwan to join TPP. That would be great, but it could be a guideline for something like this could be used in APEC at some point, or could be used in the WTO at some point. It would be modified, of course. So let's get out in front. So whoever's in charge at that point in Taiwan has some external backing. And then the general comment is very similar to what Rupert just said. So I did this when I was in the private sector, did this tour of Asia in 2005. And if you all can remember back that far, the entire region is just absolutely triumphant. We are doing so well because of our policies. And the stop in Taiwan was no different than the stop in a whole bunch of other countries. Like, wouldn't this be a great opportunity to engage in fundamental reform? When you have a strong macroeconomic system, you have clear flaws, we don't need to. And now, of course, it's too hard, because the economic situation is difficult. So I'm just going to repeat what Rupert has to say. The change, we can talk about this administration in Taiwan versus the previous administration, or we can talk about the change in economic situation from, well, when everything's great, we don't need to reform. When everything's terrible, we can't reform. But the situation is still the same. People have to take on some political pain. And that gets, you know, just to finish up, to tie back to our to Jeff's analogy, if you don't think you have to take it on the way the Vietnamese do, if you're not scared to death, then you're looking for excuses. That's a bipartisan thing. It's a bipartisan thing in Washington. It's a bipartisan thing in Taipei. So there's a specific help on SOEs we might get from the TPP, but in terms of the big issues, it's a tough job, and someone in Taiwan has to step forward and say, I'll take the pain. I mean, people are going to criticize me, and I'm just going to persist.
Anything?
Oh, okay, I have 2 points. One, TIFA, for more than 15 years, I think Taiwan took a lot of pain. One after another was precondition. I must say there's been somewhat of a TIFA fatigue. It is not that we are not willing to take the pain. We probably took too many pains. And then compared with early harvest, relatively speaking, that's a very, very different treatment on that. Second point I want to make about APEC and WTO, we're very much part of them. And of course, we hope that, you know, the engine will move forward, locomotive will be there. But unfortunately, there are a lot of analysts that have come forth different perspective on that, including TIFA actually is derailing the APEC operation. And since 2010, when we didn't have the treatment of a developed economy achieving the liberalization, and then basically there's no free lunch, right? That's why we have to create FTA negotiation rather than self-motivated liberalization. Therefore, you know, APEC somewhat losing the steam as long as TPP continue to be promoted. It probably will not only derail APEC, and some in RCEP believe that it is derailing RCEP as well. Now, WTO, we come to the same situation and cycle again and again. After Doha round, many aspirations arise regarding the December trade ministerial meeting. Some talk about beyond Doha. But, you know, you can always repackage the same bottle with a new bottle with the same old wine. But then, you know, the issue didn't shake away. It recur again, even if you go to talk about beyond Doha, but the issues of developing economy, how to forge a balanced growth there remains. So we keep continue to devise different human constructs. But the spirit or the willingness is not there to really forge a mutually beneficial schemes. I think all this will be in vain in the long run. Thank you.
Thanks. Just very quickly, it's interesting. I actually see the TPP's impact on APEC just the opposite. I mean, I think that it has a potential to energize APEC, and given that the differences in the two institutions, if you can call APEC an institution, I can't see how it can take away from APEC. They do very different things, and I think APEC also has the capacity to absorb RCEP, which is the plan expressly. That is to use RCEP and TPP as pillars of a future FTA-AP. Otherwise, if they don't do that, I think APEC does become irrelevant. The other thing I just wanted to mention, just for clarification, I can't speak for Jeff, but I think I hear in Rupert and Derek, and knowing them both, at least the three of us not opposed to ECFA or see U.S. Some sort of zero-sum game between the U.S. and China and its engagement of Taiwan on the economic side. I hope Taiwan takes advantage of opportunity in China as much as everyone else in the world does. Why shouldn't it? It has some natural advantages. It should do that. So anyway, enough from me. Let me take another question. Right there in the back.
Hi, thanks. Jamie Strawbridge from Inside U.S. Trade. Just had one very specific question, one kind of broad question. Rupert, could we go back to the TIFA for 1 second? I mean, you talked about how you'd like to see some incremental progress, in these coming months, so that you can kind of have that US-Taiwan relationship hopefully continuing to deepen. Can you elaborate on that a little bit? I mean, what types of things would you like to see in terms of trade or investment issues and incremental progress coming up here in the next months or year? I mean, for those of us that follow the TIFA, we mostly just hear about ractopamine and pork or whatever, but maybe you can kind of clue us in more on what would be good signs and give us some perspective on if the difficulties that Taiwan is facing in domestic reform, if those are going to bleed over into TIFA, if it's going to be very hard to make progress in TIFA, given the kind of political problems with economic reform that are now present in Taiwan. And then my broader question, maybe I'm just trying to kind of piece together everyone's very interesting comments on Taiwan. I mean, it seems like there's a consensus that things like TPP, things like RCEP are going to pose competitive challenges to Taiwan if Taiwan doesn't join them. And of course, the two options there are Taiwan does join them, right? The political dynamic with China changes so that they can join, and Taiwan takes on reforms that would allow it to be a trading partner that could join. That's one option. And the other option, I think more like Jeff was saying, is, okay, they could also push the other buttons. They could push the WTO, they could push APEC as much as possible. But I'm trying to figure out if either of those two options are really viable to kind of save Taiwan's competitive position. I mean, is there any chance they'll join these initiatives in the next 10 years, or in time to kind of save them? And if there's not, is there any chance that APEC and stalled WTO can do enough in the near term to save them? Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, thank you for the question. First, I'd just make an observation about where we are in negotiations. We're thankfully not going to see a lot of headlines on where things stand in the TIFA negotiation process between now and the next TIFA meeting, and I hope it'll be somewhere around March of next year. Because frankly, headlines are much more focused on the politics of it, as opposed to the minutiae and the details that require such attention and such time to work through. I noted the creation of working groups to look at and investigate in more detail specific areas that could result in potentially significant building blocks for the relationship, a term that Rick came up with actually a few years ago, and could in fact result in significant agreements like a bilateral investment agreement. We've also got bicameral issues, the legal issues regarding how you process and ratify an bilateral economic agreement with Taiwan. That will require
the Department of State's lawyers to stop rubbing their hands together and actually make a decision on how to handle it. And then sequencing will be important. Sequencing is always important. Fortunately, and I'm not just shining the sun at everybody. There really are very smart people, obviously, at both ends, who do understand the importance of sequencing when it comes to negotiations and agreements. If we get a bilateral investment agreement, let's say in 2 years, put us in 2015, right? So we've got, we'll be ramping up with our presidential election. This issue probably won't be a huge political hot potato for the Republicans and the Democrats, but a BIA for Taiwan and any potential legislative reform and dislocation economically, that may well be an issue that would get thrown around a good bit in the context of a broader discussion on Taiwan's economic well-being. And so I do think that we are going to reach a point, I hope, in a couple of years where we're going to have some significant agreements to announce, and that certainly at the Taiwan end, that has the potential to get caught up in a broader discussion in Taiwan about how is Taiwan doing economically, how much urgency is required, and if we're doing deals with the Americans or the Chinese, how should we balance the priority and sequencing for those? And what, anyway, I'll stop there. Sorry.
If I understood the second part of your question, it was if not TPP, then what are those other options if there's no prospect or if the prospects are low? Did I get that?
I mean, like to Jeff's point, I guess. I mean, he's saying Taiwan should be pushing all the buttons that it can, right? And the
What
buttons
are
that
they?
it can push. Well, no, we know he said what they are. They're the WTO and APEC. But I mean, is there really a prospect that anything that could happen in the WTO and APEC in the next 5 to 10 years would do enough to, bolster Taiwan's competitiveness enough to kind of solve this? Okay, they're not participating in TPP RCEP, for instance.
Okay, got it.
Well, the quick answer is yes. If TPP and RCEP are moving forward and the Chinese are interested in TPP, there will be a strong political and economic desire to build that bridge between the two. And that's where APEC comes in. You already have that process where they're looking at pathways, and suddenly the APEC processes, which have been sort of modest, that's in the past, become much more concrete. And then with the urging of all of the key players in the region, then you say, well, let's see how we can integrate the RCEP and TPP approaches and really move on FTA-AP, and Taiwan can be in the middle of that.
And I'd just add to that, again, if Taiwan is reforming domestically, if the Taiwanese private sector is changing, it's not like Taiwan has to bang its head against a wall while TPP is moving on, and then APEC takes a long time to do everything. The WTO takes even longer, and so Taiwan's stuck. There are remarkably valuable domestic changes that could be made where Taiwan wouldn't be falling behind. And when you say 5 to 10 years, what could possibly happen in the WTO? I know right now it looks like nothing will ever happen in the WTO again. But 10 years ago, we didn't think that. 10 years is a long time for these institutions, for APEC to stop being so modest. And if Taiwan is ready for the changes, that cuts the time until Taiwan sees benefits down. This is back to Jeff's point about things don't happen when you sign the agreement. They happen on a lot more drawn-out schedule than that. So yes, if Taiwan just sits and hopes for the WTO to do something, that sounds like a lousy strategy. But if Taiwan prepares itself, and in the time frame we're talking about, either APEC or the WTO or another institutional arrangement can offer Taiwan an option, then I think the odds aren't so bad as it might seem when you look at how dormant the WTO is now, for example.
We continue to sign the BIA, the Bilateral Investment Agreement. We finished one with Japan, and then on the pipelines, Singapore and New Zealand, which are both in TPP as well. So it's in addition to our unilateral improvement in our competitiveness in the regional supply chain connectivity, we are also gearing toward bilateral FTAs. And then hopefully with TIFA and then, with FTA with the United States, things will improve tremendously. We do hope to link it into TPP as early as possible, although the idea is the completion within the APEC 2020. We do hope to get in as early as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. Right here.
Thank you for the wonderful discussion. My name is Shi Ting. I'm with MLEX News. This is a question for all the panelists. As mentioned just now, the mainland China and Taiwan just signed the cross-straits service trade agreement last week. So how would you comment on this service trade agreement, and how would you think it would contribute to Taiwan's progress of getting involved into different sets of economic regional integration? Thank you.
Do you, maybe Man-Jung and
Very
and,
quickly.
Rupert?
Services industry, the agreement really signal that bilateral cross-trade services industry is sort of shifted from WTO minus to WTO normal and some sector WTO plus, right? Because we have a lot of our investment toward mainland China, but we restricted mainland China's inward investment to Taiwan. So by opening up the service sector, actually, partially, it's normalized our WTO MFN treatment to other WTO members, and partially it is WTO plus. So I think it will created more opportunities for the third-party countries such as Japan. They have already awaiting this for a long time. That by forging by BIA with Taiwan, we are jointly going to the mainland market and then get Taiwan more attractive. Thank you.
The service agreement is an important milestone in the ongoing ECFA negotiations, but I would suggest to all of you that the bigger question is what's next? What's going to come after services? As Man-Jung points out, there are important economic benefits. I thought it was quite interesting that you noted some frustration over the TIFA process and how difficult it has been for Taiwan, but that early harvest was a very good experience. And but here's where the politics of it all come in, right? And the question is, what are the Chinese looking for? And what are their motivations? Why do they continue to give more than they get back? And that's the political component here. When we engage on TIFA, we're not looking to make Taiwan the 51st state in the Union. China has very different motives in respect to its economic engagement. So the services agreement is an important agreement, and again, one that's an important milestone for the Ma government. I think the bigger question is, what's next? How much pressure is behind the scene for Taiwan now to pivot away from just economic and cultural agreements to political agreements? And how well is the Ma government able to either fend that off or engage the Chinese? So that would be my thoughts around the services agreement.
The one thing that I've looked at it from the perspective of agreements with other countries in the region. I mean, my understanding was that Singapore and New Zealand are just waiting for this agreement to be done. And as soon as it's done, it's just a sequencing issue. So now that the services agreement is done, we should see announcement of conclusion and signing of the agreement with Singapore and New Zealand. And that would be a very good development in both cases. I think we've got to leave it there. Thanks a lot, folks, for coming out, and thank you for joining us today. Appreciate it.